The crowd gathered that afternoon expected silence. They came for stillness, for the rare privilege of watching a man dedicate every breath to guarding the sacred ground before him. The tomb guard stood at his post, immaculate in his uniform, his weapon gleaming in the pale light. Each step he had taken earlier in his meticulous march still seemed to echo in their minds. Tourists shuffled for better angles. Children whispered questions to their parents. Veterans stood in reverent silence. Everyone understood that Herat, this place tradition ruled, and tradition meant the guard did not flinch, did not speak, did not break. But among the respectful hush, one figure did not share the reverence. A tall man with a suit far too loud for the solemn setting stood near the front. His smirk curled at the edges as he leaned back, whispering jokes to companions who chuckled too loudly. He was no ordinary heckler. His face was known, splashed across news and courtrooms, a politician-judge hybrid, infamous for his arrogance, and famous for mocking anything that tied people to rules he thought outdated. The veterans recognized him. Their jaws tightened at first. He seemed content with loud commentary, but soon his eyes flicked to the guard, and a cruel amusement sparkled. He stepped closer. "Statue boy," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "How long do you think before he cracks?" Some people gasped, others turned away. "You don't mock the guard, not here, not ever." And yet, the guard did not move. His jaw stayed locked, his gaze fixed, his body a wall of discipline. But something else stirred in that moment, something subtle, almost invisible. A small girl in the crowd, barely 10 years old, was standing near the back. Her mother's hand tried to anchor her, but her own fingers trembled. She raised them slightly, curling her fist, then opening it in a stilted rhythm. Once, twice, again. It looked random to most, but to anyone trained, to anyone watching closely, it was unmistakable. A signal, not a wave, not a child's fidget, a plea for help. The guard's eyes hidden to the crowd by the shadow of his brim shifted ever so slightly. He had seen it. The judge laughed again, stepping even closer to the invisible line that marked the guard's sacred boundary. "He's not even human," he said loudly, turning so the crowd could hear him. "Just a wind-up doll in a red coat. Watch this." The atmosphere tightened. Veterans exchanged looks. Reporters raised their cameras, lenses glinting like unblinking eyes. Children pressed against parents, sensing danger they couldn't name. Girl's hand trembled again. Her silent signal grew weaker, desperate, and there it was, the impossible choice. For the guard, every fiber of training screamed, "Do not break, do not move. Silence is duty." Yet the flicker of fear in the child's eyes, the whispered cry buried in her hand's rhythm, struck deeper than rules. The world thought the guard would remain stone, that he would stand through insult and provocation as he always had. But in that frozen silence, something had shifted. The antagonist smirked, leaning forward, about to cross the invisible threshold. The girl's fist clenched one final time. In that instant, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, because the next movement would decide everything. Asterisk. The silence of the guard was more than performance. It was the end of a long, violent road. Years before, he had worn a very different uniform. In a desert far from home, he had marched under the burning sun with men who had become closer than brothers. He remembered the sweat, the sand in his teeth, and the smell of smoke that clung to his skin no matter how hard he scrubbed. Most of all, he remembered the night he lost his best friend, Corporal James Harker. They had shared everything, cigarettes passed in the dark, letters from home, whispered promises that they would both make it back. But war breaks promises. A roadside blast tore through their convoy, and in the choking haze of dust and fire, the guard carried James's body until his arms could carry no more. That night etched a vow into his soul: "If I survive, I will live the rest of my days protecting those who cannot protect themselves." It was that vow that eventually brought him here. To most, standing still in ceremonial silence might look easy. To him, it was not. It was endurance. It was penance. Each step he took in his precision walk was for James. Each moment of stillness was a wall against chaos. Each second of silence was louder than the thunder of war. He had chosen to guard the tomb not for pageantry, but because here, finally, he could live by an oath. And in that silence, he could keep his friend alive. The antagonist, however, had lived a very different life. Judge Marcus Leclerc, some called him the Laughing Judge, had made a career of tearing down institutions. He had started as a clever lawyer who could twist tradition into ridicule. What others respected, he mocked. He saw rules as shackles, uniforms as costumes, and silence as weakness. Politics only inflated him. He became a face for cynicism, standing on podiums, charming crowds with wit that dripped with poison. When cameras were near, he performed like a comedian who never cared for the damage left behind. And now, here he was, visiting this sacred site not for respect, but for spectacle. For him, it was another stage, another chance to prove to himself and to everyone watching that nothing, not even the nation's most disciplined guardians, could resist his mockery. The setting only sharpened the contrast between them. The tomb of the unknown. The soldier had always carried weight. To the untrained eye, it was stone and silence. But to veterans, to families of the fallen, it was the most sacred heartbeat of the land. Each hour of silence stood as a shield for the nameless dead who had given everything. Every guard who walked here carried not just a rifle, but the invisible weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Tourists often arrived expecting ceremony, but those who stayed long enough understood it was not about spectacle. It was about endurance, tradition, a living oath. And so, when Judge Leclerc laughed at that oath, the veterans in the crowd stiffened. They knew what it meant. This was not just an insult to the guard. It was an insult to the fallen, yet hidden within the crowd was the smallest, most fragile detail. A girl 10 years old, thin frame, eyes too serious for her age. She stood half-shielded by her mother's coat, almost as though she wanted to disappear. To most onlookers, she was just another child. But her trembling fingers betrayed her, curling into a fist, opening, curling, again timed, deliberate, desperate. The guard saw it, of course he did. He had been trained to notice everything: the twitch of a tourist's hand, the flicker of a camera flash, the misplaced step of a bird crossing his line. And so, when he saw the girl's subtle motion, something stirred within him. It was not random, it was a signal. Once, during his deployments, local children had been trained to use the same subtle rhythm to call for help without drawing attention. Open, close, open, close, a cry without sound. The world around him may have thought he was frozen, staring ahead, but behind the shadow of his cap, his eyes had locked on hers. He had seen her. He understood. To the guard, silence was sacred. To the judge, silence was weakness. And to the girl, silence was a prison she could not break. All three were now bound, together by one invisible thread. The guard, haunted by loss, carrying a vow. The judge, inflated by arrogance, ready to tear at the sacred. The girl, desperate for rescue, her life compressed into a coded flicker of fingers. The stage was set. The crowd thought they were here to witness another ordinary changing of the guard, a ceremony of steps, a performance of silence. But beneath the stillness, storms were building. The guard's vow, the judge's arrogance, the girl's secret plea. In minutes, they would all collide. The air shifted when Judge Marcus Leclerc decided silence wasn't enough. At first, his mocking comments seemed like passing noise, a ripple in the reverent hush, but each new word cut deeper, and with every insult, the sacred weight of the place seemed to shudder. "Imagine standing here your whole life," he said, loud enough for the nearest tourists to hear. His voice was laced with scorn. "Guarding stones, pretending you matter." A father near the front pulled his young son closer, whispering something sharp in his ear. Words the boy nodded to without question. Veterans clenched their jaws, fists tightening against canes and folded programs. One man muttered, "Shut your mouth," but he said it too softly for the judge to notice. The guard, however, noticed everything. He noticed the judge's tone, the crowd's discomfort, and most of all the little girl's hand. Her signal continued. Curl, open, but slower now, weaker. The guard's heart beat like a drum behind his silence. To anyone watching, he remained unmoving, eyes fixed forward. But behind the discipline, a war raged. Training screamed, "Do not break, do not move." But instinct whispered louder, "She needs you." Judge Leclerc stepped closer, breaking the invisible circle of respect. Most people naturally observed. "Tell me," he sneered, raising his voice so the cameras could catch every word. "Do they program you to blink, or is that against the rules too?" A ripple of laughter came from two reporters who didn't understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. Their chuckles quickly died when veterans turned on them with scalding glares. The guard's jaw shifted, not a twitch, not a crack, but a tightening of muscle that only the closest would notice. He did not look at the judge. He did not blink. His rifle remained angled, polished, perfect. But the girl's hand, curl open. The judge moved again, stepping deliberately closer until he stood near the edge of the guard's ceremonial line. Gasps rose from the crowd. Everyone knew what it meant to cross that invisible boundary. Even children understood, as their parents had whispered rules to them moments before. You do not test the guard. You do not break his silence. But Leclerc was not here for respect. He was here for spectacle. Look at this. Everyone, he barked, spinning to face the tourists with arms spread wide. The most expensive mannequin in the country. Taxpayer dollars, and he won't even smile for a child. He gestured toward the crowd with mocking flourish, but his hand swung dangerously close to the guard's shoulder. The veterans inhaled sharply. The line had not yet been crossed, but it was so close. Too close. The little girl's signal faltered, her small fingers shook as if her strength was leaving her. She looked toward the guard, eyes wide with fear that no one else seemed to notice. Mothers pulled their children closer. Some tourists whispered about leaving, but others couldn't look away. It was theater, it was danger, it was tradition under fire. Reporters steadied their cameras, realizing they might capture history. The veterans stood like stone, torn between their fury at the judge and their reverence for the guard's oath. They would not interfere. They knew this moment belonged to the sentinel in front of them. The guard's body remained marble, but inside, his heart struck with urgency. He thought of James, his fallen friend, of that last night in the desert, when silence had been broken by explosions and cries for help. He had promised himself that if he lived, he would never ignore a call for help again. And now, here it was, wrapped in the tiny hands of a trembling child. The judge's voice rose. Do you think he bleeds? Should we test him? He laughed, but no one joined him this time. His grin faltered for a split second when he saw the crowd's cold stares, but arrogance carried him forward. He leaned in, eyes inches from the guard's stoic face. Say something, he hissed. Anything. Or are you too weak? Gasps. Silence. Even the birds seemed to pause in the air. The guard did not move. His weapon remained still, his boots rooted in centuries of tradition, but beneath the brim of his cap, his eyes flicked once more to the girl. Her small hand opened and closed for what felt like the last time. The world narrowed. The judge, the crowd, the girl. The girl, the vow. The guard's stillness became unbearable. Like the silence before, a storm. Every second stretched into eternity. Children buried their faces in parents' coats. Veterans stood taller, their bodies aching with memory. Reporters held their breath, waiting for the explosion. Then Leclerc did what everyone prayed he wouldn't. Crossed the line. It wasn't a full step, not yet, but his polished shoe touched the edge of the guard's ceremonial path, a deliberate violation. The crowd reacted instantly, gasping, some even shouting, "Stop!" The judge smiled wider, mistaking the outrage for attention. He raised his hand and wagged a finger inches from the guard's face. See, nothing. He's powerless, just a toy soldier. The veterans nearly erupted, but something stopped them. It was not fear, it was not hesitation. It was the simple knowledge that the guard did not need them. This was his moment, his oath. The girl's fingers trembled one final time before her small hand fell to her side, and in that silence, the judge laughed, victorious. But what he didn't see, what only the guard felt, was the shift inside his chest, the unshakable weight of an oath colliding with the desperate eyes of a child. Stillness was discipline, stillness was honor, but stillness had its limits. The guard remained unmoving for now, yet every fiber of the air screamed. Something was about to break. The judge thought he had one. The crowd thought they were witnessing tradition crumble, but, in truth, they were about to witness what tradition really meant. The invisible line was never meant to be crossed. Every visitor knew it. Every veteran felt it in their bones. The tomb guard's path was sacred, measured, guarded, untouchable. But arrogance is blind, and Judge Marcus Leclerc stepped past that line as though it were nothing but a painted stripe on stone. The air collapsed into silence. Not the respectful silence of ceremony, but the suffocating kind that swallows entire crowds whole. A mother gasped and pulled her child back. Veterans stiffened like drawn swords. A reporter whispered, "Oh God," before realizing her mic was still on. Leclerc grinned, savoring the shock. His polished shoe was planted where no civilian dared tread. He lifted his hand, extended one finger, and tapped the edge of the guard's rifle. Tot tap. That single sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. The guard's body remained stone, but inside, every nerve fired. That rifle wasn't a prop. It wasn't for show. It was a symbol of eternal vigilance, of a promise carried by generations, and now it had been touched, violated. The clerk leaned closer, his lips inches from the guard's ear. "See, nothing, not even a twitch. You're not a man, you're furniture." The crowd could barely breathe. Children clutched their parents. Veterans ground their teeth. The girl, her hand now limp at her side, stared with wide, desperate eyes. And then it happened. The guard moved, not with fury, not with rage, but with precision. A sharp step forward, heel striking stone like thunder. His rifle shifted upward, no longer a ceremonial decoration but a line of steel separating arrogance from sacred duty. The sound split, the silence, gasps, erupted. Cameras clicked wildly. Veterans straightened, their weathered faces alight with fierce pride. Children stopped crying, stunned into wide-eyed awe. Leclerc stumbled back half a step, his smirk faltering. "Oh," he started, but the guard's voice cut through him like a blade. "Sir, you have disrespected the tomb. Step back immediately." The words were crisp, powerful, carried by years of discipline. The crowd froze. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard a tomb guard speak. Leclerc blinked, caught off guard. His grin twitched uncertainly. "Oh, so you can talk," he sneered, but his voice cracked. "What are you going to do? Arrest me?" The guard didn't flinch, he repeated, louder this time, voice booming with authority. "Step back now." The sacred ground vibrated with the command. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even an argument. It was law, spoken through tradition. The judge laughed nervously, scanning the crowd for support. But no one laughed with him. The veterans stared him down. The mothers clutched their children tighter. Even the reporters, cameras rolling, held their breath as if they knew they were recording something greater than scandal. They were recording history. The girl, still trembling, lifted her hand again. This time, the signal wasn't desperate. It was hopeful. That the guard's eyes flicked to her for the briefest second. He had seen her. He had answered. That Leclerc noticed the flicker. His grin returned, but now it was brittle. He jabbed his finger into the guard's chest. "You think you scare me," he spat. "You're a puppet in a costume, nothing more." The crowd gasped again. A finger jab to the uniform was beyond insult. It was provocation. The guard's body moved faster than thought. His boot struck forward, planting firmly. His rifle snapped into a ready hold, angled but steady, and his voice, louder than before, rang out. "You will show respect, or you will be removed." Every syllable hit like a drumbeat. The echo carried across stone, across crowd, across history itself. Leclerc's smile died. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He glanced around, searching for someone to laugh, someone to agree, but found only the cold silence of condemnation. The veterans began to nod, slowly, firmly. One even whispered, "That's how it's done." The guard's rifle gleamed in the light, no longer ceremonial, but a living reminder of strength restrained by discipline. His body was unyielding, his voice unbreakable. Leclerc tried to laugh it off. "Fine, fine. Don't get so serious. It's just a step back." The judge froze. The voice left no room for negotiation. It was not a suggestion. It was an order born from centuries of sacrifice, delivered through the throat of one man who carried all those centuries within him. For a long moment, the judge teetered between arrogance and fear. His smirk twitched, faltered, and finally collapsed. He stepped back. The crowd exhaled in unison, as though a spell had been broken. Children peeked from behind coats. Veterans allowed themselves the smallest smiles. Cameras clicked furiously. The little girl, tears on her cheeks, clenched her fist one final time, not as a signal, but as a thank you. The guard's eyes softened, just barely, under the brim of his cap, but his posture remained perfect. His rifle held steady. His silence, now broken once, returned like a wall of stone. Leclerc muttered under his breath, trying to salvage his pride, but his words were drowned by the rising murmurs of the crowd. Murmurs that carried one truth. They had witnessed discipline rise above arrogance. The judge had crossed the line, the guard had responded, and in that response, centuries of tradition had proven themselves alive, unshakable, and stronger than ever. The girl was safe. The vow was kept. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with awe. For a moment, silence ruled the sacred ground again, but it was a new silence, charged and alive, born, not of routine, but of revelation. The guard had spoken. He had moved, and the world would never forget it. Judge Marcus Leclerc stood frozen, his polished shoes suddenly feeling far too heavy. He looked around, expecting chuckles, applause, even sympathy. Instead, he found only the hard stares of veterans, the wide eyes of children, and the steady, unblinking cameras of reporters. The crowd had shifted. Where before they were spectators, now they were witnesses. "Step back," the guard had ordered, and the judge had obeyed. No amount of arrogance could erase that truth. Leclerc forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "Oh, come on," he muttered. "This is ridiculous. He's just a man in a costume." But his words landed flat. No one laughed, no one agreed. Even his companions, who had chuckled at his earlier jokes, now kept their eyes down, ashamed to be seen at his side. The guard did not reply. He did not need to. His silence was heavier than any insult, sharper than any retort. Then came the sound of boots, measured, disciplined, unmistakable. Military police approached swiftly from the side, summoned by unseen signals. They closed in on the judge with efficient precision, their expressions stern. Sir, one of them said firmly, "You're coming with us." Leclerc's face drained of color. He stammered, pointing wildly at the guard. He moved first. He threatened me. You all saw it, but the crowd's reaction silenced him. Veterans shook their heads in disgust. A mother whispered fiercely, "Shame on you," loud enough for others to echo. Reporters captured every angle, their microphones recording the rising tide of condemnation. The little girl, clutching her mother's hand now, looked directly at the judge with quiet defiance. Her fear was gone. Leclerc sputtered, but resistance was useless. The officers flanked him, guiding him away as cameras clicked furiously. His protests faded into the distance, swallowed by the weight of his own humiliation, and through it all, the guard remained motionless, as though nothing had happened. He did not follow the officers, he did not bask in victory, he did not even glance at the departing figure of the disgraced judge. Instead, he adjusted his rifle with practiced precision, pivoted on his heel, and resumed his post. The symbolism was undeniable. The world had just watched arrogance crumble, tradition endure, and duty outlast chaos. For the crowd, awe replaced tension. Parents whispered to children, explaining the lesson they had just witnessed. Veterans stood straighter, their chests swelling with pride. Reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, realizing the story was larger than scandal. It was history, and the girl. She leaned against her mother, tears still drying on her cheeks, but now her hand no longer trembled. She raised it slightly, not in signal, not in plea, but in gratitude, a quiet salute, in her own small way. The guard saw. He did not move, did not nod, but deep within, a vow had been honored. Seconds stretched. Then, like the closing of a chapter, the guard's footsteps resumed, measured, deliberate, eternal. The sound echoed across the stone like a drumbeat of resilience. Dot, click, 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 dot. The viral moment was already sealed. Dozens of cameras had caught every frame, the insult, the violation, the guard's thunderous command, the judge's faltering retreat. Within hours the world would see it, within days it would become legend, but for those present, no video could capture the electricity of the silence that followed. They had not just witnessed a man defend tradition, they had witnessed a man's discipline shield the vulnerable, without ego, without fury, without breaking his oath. Dot. And as the guard's march faded into steady rhythm, the truth crystallized in every heart. Stillness was not weakness. Silence was not surrender. And honor, when tested, was unbreakable. The echoes of the judge's removal lingered only for moments before the sacred stillness returned. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer fragile, threatened by arrogance. It was stronger, deeper, fortified by what had just transpired. The guard resumed his post with measured steps, his rifle angled in flawless precision. To the casual eye, he was exactly as he had been before, an unmoving sentinel. But to those who had witnessed the confrontation, he was something more, a living reminder that tradition, when tested, did not break. From the corner of the crowd, an older man stepped forward slowly. His uniform was gone, replaced by civilian clothes, but the straightness of his spine betrayed decades of service. A colonel once, perhaps more. He stood still, then lifted a trembling hand to his brow in salute. No words, just a silent acknowledgement. From one soldier to another. Other veterans followed suit. Hands rose in quiet reverence, saluting the guard not just as a figure of ritual, but as a brother in arms. Tourists, not knowing how to salute, simply stood straighter, some placing hands over their hearts. Even children, sensing the gravity, fell into silence. The guard did not move in reply, but inside, the weight of their respect pressed against his chest like a medal he could never wear. Near the back, the little girl leaned close to her mother. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but those near her heard it, and it carried like a spark through dry grass. "He's a hero," she said. The words, so small, so fragile, seemed to bind the moment together. A few in the crowd smiled through tears. The veterans nodded. Mothers squeezed their children's shoulders. The girl no longer looked afraid. She stood taller, her eyes clear, her small hand no longer trembling. The guard, outwardly still, felt the words pierce deeper than any applause ever could. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he had promised himself, long ago, that he would never again ignore a cry for help. Today, that promise had been kept. Beneath the uniform, hidden from all but himself, he carried a single keepsake, a battered dog tag, dulled with age, engraved with a name that was not his own. Corporal James Harker. As his boots struck the stone, in their eternal rhythm, his fingers brushed the metal through the fabric of his uniform. For a fleeting moment, he felt as though James walked beside him again, that his vow, born in the dust of war, had not been in vain. He thought of James's last words, whispered in the chaos of that desert night. Don't let them be forgotten. Here guarding the tomb, he had honored that. And today, by breaking silence to shield the living, he had honored it again. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but they left differently than they had arrived. They carried with them more than photographs and video clips. They carried the story of a guard who had stood against arrogance, who had broken tradition not to dishonor it, but to protect the innocent it symbolized. They would tell their children, they would share it with friends, and before long the world would know. But the guard did not think of cameras or headlines. He thought only of his duty, of the oath he carried, and of the silent promise that tomorrow he would stand here again. Silent, still, eternal. For now, the world whispered. For him, the world was quiet again, and in that quiet he felt at peace. Tradition can appear fragile to those who do not understand it. To some, it is just a performance, old rules, stiff rituals, silence mistaken for weakness. But today, the world saw what tradition truly is, that it is not weakness, it is not silence, it is strength, forged in sacrifice. It is stillness, carved by discipline. When the judge stepped forward, he believed that power was measured in arrogance, that by mocking, shoving, and taunting, he could bend others to his will. But one guard showed us the truth, that real power is found in restraint, in the courage to hold your ground without needing to shout, without needing to strike. And when the moment came, when innocence stood at risk, that same discipline became a shield. The guard broke the silence, not to abandon tradition, but to fulfill its purpose, to protect the living and honor the fallen. A child called him a hero. A colonel saluted him. Strangers left carrying a memory they will never forget. But for the guard himself, it was not about glory. It was about keeping a promise, carrying forward the weight of brothers lost, and ensuring that honor did not fade. The world watched, cameras recorded, and in that silence, broken only by truth, we all learned a lesson. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. And when strength is guided by honor, even a single soldier can remind the world what it means to stand unshaken. If this moment moved you, if it stirred something in your chest, then do not let it pass. Share this story. Tell others what you saw here. Honor those who stand in silence, guarding not just stone, but memory, sacrifice, and legacy. Because one day, tradition will need voices like yours to keep it alive, so carry it forward. And remember, sometimes the strongest action is the one taken in stillness.